Hello, Accounting Superstars. This is Professor Don Bush from the Accounting Superstar channel. I've been a professor for about 30 years and a CPA for about that long. And I've got great ways to explain accounting. So welcome aboard. Today's lesson is about classifying costs. So this lesson is designed for people who are in their probably second semester of accounting, maybe even cost accounting too. And if you're having any trouble figuring out what's manufacturing overhead, what's a period cost, what's direct labor, whatever, this is the lesson for you. We're going to go through a whole lot of examples so you'll get it here. It's not that hard, so just pay attention. I'm going to go rather fast, so if you have a seatbelt on your chair, fasten it up because we're going to be traveling pretty fast. So here's what we're doing here, folks. Here's what we got. I've got little pictures here to help us out too. So we need to know what category to put all of these costs in. Now this is the Sunset Sailboat Company, and they build sailboats. Some small sailboats, some big ones, really nice sailboats. So what we have going here in the first column, we've got administrative period cost here. And I have a picture, it's tiny, maybe you can't see it on your computer screen, I don't know. But here's a picture of a guy working in an office, and he's looking at his computer screen. Maybe he's playing video games or something, who knows. But period costs have to do with the office. They call them professional people, you know, like accountants, attorneys, marketing people, advertisers. But I got to tell you what, this is just my own little pet peeve here. I don't really like the term professional because there are some really talented people that work in the factory, you know, like welders and electricians and just amazing people that are so good at what they do. So, but anyways, they call them professional people, the ones that work in the office. So there you go. Now, the rest of the categories have to do with the factory or the job site, depending on, you know, what kind of company you have here. And the first column here is in green. It's called direct labor. These are people that actually work on the boats. They actually physically build the boats. Direct labor. And in the next green column, we have direct materials. Now, these are materials that are directly incorporated into the product, and they're usually very expensive components and things that the company wants to keep close track of. For instance, I've got a picture here of the teak wood. Teak wood is very, very expensive. For a board foot, you know, about 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick, a board foot, it could be $30, $40, $50 for a board foot. So it's very expensive. So direct materials are things that the company wants to keep track of, and it's worth keeping track of. And here in the blue, everything in the blue is manufacturing overhead. Everything. I know the last column says manufacturing overhead, but let me explain what's going on. In the first column, we've got indirect labor. And indirect labor would be people that work in the factory, but they are not actually building the boats. So that would include a person like this janitor, a person who keeps the factory nice and clean. Also, another person that does not directly work on the boats would be like the shift supervisor. Another one would be boat inspectors. Boat inspectors don't actually build the boats. They just look to make sure that they're built correctly. That's all they do. Very important job, though. Indirect labor. So those are people that work in the factory, but they don't actually build the boats. Now, indirect materials. These are materials that are used to build the boat. I've got a picture of some glue here. And I'm using that as an example. And they do use a lot of glue and caulking and on boats. And so indirect materials, there are things, they are things that can become part of the boat, but they're items that aren't worth tracking. Like, for instance, like if we're gluing some wood together, it'd be kind of ridiculous for somebody to say, hey, how much glue did you use? And we would probably answer, well, I have no idea, and why are you asking me such a dumb question? You know, how much glue did I use? Why do you want to know? And so there are a lot of materials like this, and small miscellaneous nuts and bolts may possibly fall into that category too. Things like varnish. Varnish is not that expensive, and it's not worth keeping close track of. That they do keep track of it, but not real closely. So indirect materials, things that are used to help build the boat, but not so important or not so expensive where we got to track them. And then, here's my point. Indirect labor and indirect materials are a part of manufacturing overhead. So if you want to get this right, anytime you check off the box indirect labor or indirect materials, you also check off the box manufacturing overhead, because manufacturing overhead contains indirect labor and indirect materials. All right, but we do differentiate a bit here. And manufacturing overhead is everything else that happens in the factory. Property taxes for the factory, insurance for the factory, painting the factory, air conditioning the factory, factory utilities. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. There's a lot of things that fall into manufacturing overhead. All right, so are you ready to get started? What I'll do is I'll split the screen here so we can see what's going on. I'll keep the pictures here to help out too. So hold on, because we're going to go pretty fast. And if I go too fast, just rewind the video and watch it again. So here we go, folks. Navigation compass and GPS units that are installed on the boats. And these are pretty pricey items. So that would be considered a direct material. Marketing brochures. Now this has to do with the office, the marketing manager. That's called a period cost. Court and attorney fees. That also has to do with the office, probably the head office. Vice president of marketing, his or her salary in the office. Everything that has to do in the office is a period cost. Factory janitor. Well, that would be indirect labor. And we have to check off manufacturing overhead too, all right? Because it's the same thing. Indirect labor is the same thing as manufacturing overhead, but sometimes we distinguish it a little bit. One more time, indirect labor and indirect materials are part of manufacturing overhead. Salesperson travel expenses, that's a period cost. Factory day shift supervisor, that's indirect labor. And since it's indirect labor, it's also manufacturing overhead. You can use, the words interchangeably. Boat inspector salary, well, that's indirect labor. The boat inspector is not directly building a boat, but is doing a very important job. It's manufacturing overhead. So check this out. Anytime I put a check mark in indirect labor, I also put a check mark in manufacturing overhead. Boat electronics technician. Well, this is a person that is actually building the boat. That's direct labor. Window washing expense, the administrative offices, that's a period cost. And by the way, if you don't know what a period cost is, I made another video on period costs, and I went into quite a bit of depth. And so you can check it out. By the way, that reminds me, check out the website, accountingsuperstars.com. I've got all these videos listed by topics, so you can watch these, watch videos that interest you. Corporate website maintenance, well, that's a period cost. Boat parts and supplies inventory manager. Now, this person is working in the factory, so indirect labor. Here we go. Oh, on the wrong line. No wonder it wouldn't check. There we go. So this is indirect labor because this person is not actually building the boats, all right? But since I checked indirect labor, I also got to check manufacturing overhead. They're the same thing. Property tax regarding factory machines, that would be just manufacturing overhead. It's not indirect labor. It's not indirect materials. It's just overhead. Property tax regarding the administrative furniture. So you may or may not know this, but the government oftentimes taxes things like business furniture. Can you believe it? Like a business desk. At least down in Arizona they did, and I'm sure they do it in a lot of other states. Salesperson travel expenses. Well, there we go. Period costs. Boat fiberglass and paint technician. That is direct labor. Vice president year-end bonus. That is a period cost. Do you notice everything about the office is a period cost? Human resource department expenses. That's certainly the office. Christmas gifts for factory workers. That would be manufacturing overhead. Has to do with the factory. So coming on down, factory machine setup expenses. And sometimes this can be quite expensive. So manufacturing overheads taking place in the factory. Labor to install sailboat factory safety equipment. All right, so this would be indirect labor. All right, indirect labor. And it's part of manufacturing overhead because these people, it's labor, but they're not building boats. All right, they're installing safety equipment. Boat carpenter, now that's a person building the boats. Insurance cost for the corporate jet. They are doing quite well to have a corporate jet. Water, glue, and paint for sailboat manufacture. Now, these are items that go into the boat. You know, they're part of the boat, but they're not worth keeping track of. So rather than direct materials, we'll call them indirect materials. Indirect materials are things that really, not worth keeping real close track of. It's just not worth our time. And since I checked that box, I also have to check manufacturing overhead because indirect materials is manufacturing overhead. They're the same thing. But sometimes when we speak, we differentiate them. Retirement party for administrative workers, that's a period cost. Brass door handles installed on boats. Now those can be kind of pricey, so we'll keep track of those and we'll call it direct materials. Boat head toilet installed on boat. Now those can be kind of expensive too. So, and we want to keep track of them. So direct materials. So direct materials are materials that go into the production of the boat. They become part of the boat, and they're rather expensive. So we want to track them. Fiberglass. SSC's boats are made of fiberglass. Now modern sailboats are made out of fiberglass, and that's something that adds up to be a big cost. So fiberglass, yep, we're tracking that. Waterproof caulking for the port lights. Now that's so water doesn't leak into the windows, to the boat windows. And it's really not worth tracking. It's sort of like a glue type of material. It's important. You don't want your windows to leak, but it's not worth tracking carefully. So put them in two spots. Office supplies for the corporate attorney. That's an office expense. Varnish for the boat teak wood. Well, that's a material that goes as part of the boat. It's not really worth tracking very carefully. I mean, nobody's going to ask, how much varnish did you use exactly? So there we go. Boat anchors. Now, boat anchors, they're easy to track and they can be a little pricey. I mean, they're not too bad. Boat trailer welder technician. So this is also building the product, all right, working on the product. Boat trailers, some boats are small enough where they can be trailered around. And so this is part of the product for certain boats. So we'll put it under direct labor. Canvas for making sails, direct material. Some of that canvas can be really expensive. Some of it's made out of Dacron, which is really light for racing sails. Boat inventory receiving department manager. Well, this person works in the factory and is not building boats, but is keeping track of what arrives. So that should, wrong place. Indirect labor, which is also manufacturing overhead. There we go. Lines, sheets, and halyards. And these are just words for ropes. All right, and this can be really expensive, and I got to tell you from my experience, it's not worth buying cheap ropes. They call them lines in sailing. That would be the proper term. So it's not worth it buying cheap lines. You want to buy really good stuff. Grease for factory machines. Well, it's not really worth tracking the grease. Grease is pretty cheap, and who cares how much you use? Just so the machines get greased. That's the important thing. Factory lunchroom coffee supplies, that's factory overhead because it's taking place in the factory. Boat sanding machine operator. Now this is a person that's building the boats, sanding the boats to be specific. Plastic wire connectors for electrical components. Well, these are little plastic items that are really super cheap and they're not worth keeping track of. Like, who cares if you used 4 or 5 of them or 10 or 20? I mean, they are so cheap. So we'll call that an indirect material. And since I'm clicking something in that column, I also click manufacturing overhead because they're one and the same. Boat diesel engines. You can be sure they're tracking those things. They're expensive and they're big and There you go. Okay, boat port lights. Those are the windows, usually in a round shape, and those can be expensive because they're oftentimes made out of brass. Administrative office bookshelf. Well, that's in the office. Teak wood for a boat deck. That's incredibly expensive, and I know the boat company will keep track of that closely. Factory shift supervisor. Now that's in the factory. And but the factory shift supervisor is not building boats. The factory shift supervisor is not out there, sanding the fiberglass or painting the fiberglass. Now, since I'm checking indirect labor, I'm going to check manufacturing overhead. There we go. Solvent for cleaning boats after sanding. Well, it's kind of the same idea as the glue and other items. It's not worth tracking. Solvent's pretty cheap. We're about done. LED taillights for the boat trailers. So these are the lights. So when people are hauling their boat and they're driving at night, people can, see the trailer. And they will keep track of this. There you go. Boat trailer wheel grease. Well, that's super, super cheap. Super cheap, not worth tracking. And we'll call it manufacturing overhead. There we go. LED interior lights for boat cabins. So these, depending on the boat, these could be cheap or expensive, but I'm sure that they would always consider that a direct material. Utility expense for the administrative office, that is a period cost. Well, there you go, folks. Well, I hope by now this gives you an idea of how these categories work. And if you're lost and if you're saying, I didn't catch this, go back and watch this video again and you'll get it. So check out the website, accountingsuperstars.com, to get a listing of all these videos. Easier to find what you're looking for. Also, hit the like button and the subscribe button. That way I'll know that you like these videos and I'll keep making more. Also in the comments, if you want, write down topics that you'd like me to make a video on, and I'll do that for you. So there you go, folks. Have a great day. Until next time, over and out.